Assalamu alaikum. Today is our final lecture of the course, and in today's lecture I'm going to review the whole course with you. Since our first lecture we have covered a long distance, and you have been able to look at the different stages in the development of English poetry, starting from the Romantic period and culminating at the modern period. We have seen the different strains of poetry. We have seen how different poets belonging to different eras have experimented with poetry or with different poetic forms. And by this time, I'm sure you have a very clear idea of the nature of poetry, because that is what this whole course is about, and that is what is crucial to your understanding of this course. I hope you've had a better idea now, and I hope you have a better understanding of what poetry actually is, and how how varied it is in form, how varied it is in technique, how varied it is or it can be in terms of language used, and how varied can it be in terms of the content or themes. You need to understand that poetry is different, is completely different from prose, and it is different from prose because of certain features that it incorporates. In our first lecture, we looked at some of those features. We studied how certain poetic devices can make a difference in a poem, and we saw as a result of those poetic devices how a poem is distinguished from a prose writing. So poetry as a discipline, as a subject, has its own boundaries, and it works within its own domains. But as we have seen that those boundaries and those domains are flexible, poets have experimented in their own ways. Poets have brought in their own individuality to their works, and that flexibility actually has lent it beauty, and it is due to that flexibility that today we have this huge variety in the form of poetry with us now. And this is why we have been able to capture the different forms, different techniques, different themes in poetry over the years, over centuries, over different eras. You must have studied the classical poetry in your previous semester, but in this semester, since we've only had to look at the post-romantic period culminating in the modern period, we had to restrict ourselves within those span of years. I'm sure even this have given you an idea of the depth and of the diversity that is part of poetry. Now, what is it that we have done throughout the course? We looked at the Romantics. We studied how Romanticism evolved as a result of its reaction to the political and social changes taking place in those times. And then as Romanticism evolved, we saw how different poets restricting themselves, not deliberately, but since all were affected by the same events in their times, we saw how each one of them brought his own individuality, brought his own style, brought his own personal touch to his work. So we saw the wide ranges being introduced in poetry. And then we moved on to the great Victorian period, the height of British imperialism. And in that long period of literary history, we saw further experiments being done in poetry. And we saw how sometimes it was in line with the Romantic tradition, and sometimes it differed arguably from the previous tradition, and it seemed to look towards the modern trends. So there was this friction, there was this ongoing struggle in the poetry or in the literature that were being produced in the Victorian era. And then we moved on to the modern period, and we saw how in the modern period, due to the wars, the two world wars that took place in the 20th century, lots of changes occurred in the social and the political domains of the world. And as a result of that, the city life, the life of an individual also was affected. And all of that was reflected in the literary works that were produced in that time period. Whether they were novelists or prose writers or poets or dramatists, they all tended to reflect those tendencies, reflect those sentiments that were part of the world at that time. So we saw the birth of symbolism, and we saw the influence of the images in the poetry or on the literature of that period. And that was where we actually stopped with some of the modern poets we looked at, and we saw how their poetry had traveled a long distance, and this journey is still not finished. There are more poets. There are contemporary poets who are writing even now. There are contemporary poets who are writing under different circumstances than their predecessors, and who are writing under a totally different environment, social and political environment, with the technological advances and with so much more happening in the world now. So their approach now can be differentiated with the approach of their predecessors, can be differentiated with the approaches of these poets that you have studied and you have come across. So the journey is still not over. As students of literature, as students of poetry, it is your task now to first to understand what is poetry. It is your task to understand how the poetic tradition has continued up till now, up till today, and you have to also see what new directions it may take in the future. So as students of poetry, you do not only attach yourselves to the thematic value of the poem or to the study of the form of the poem, and to approach a piece of poetry only for the sake of examination. Your task as students of literature or as students of poetry is to go beyond that. It is to understand the spirit of literature, and it is to understand exactly how and why is it that a writer or a poet is able to communicate to us, and why does a poet or a writer take up a specific form or take up a specific idea and expresses it in that special way that he does. So you need to explore these things. You need to ask yourselves these questions, because only when you're able to do that, you will be able to understand the true essence of poetry, and you shall be able to understand any form of poem you read, and you shall be able to attempt any question on that poem. So your understanding is paramount. It is the most important thing. Your understanding of what poetry is, that is important. A true understanding will help you score better even in your examination. So my advice to you is to go for a better understanding of poetry, and to go for a comprehensive understanding of the poets and the social and the political circumstances in which they were writing, to adapt yourself to their conditions, to feel the way they felt, to imagine the way they felt, to feel the power when they are writing something. And when you are able to do that, when you are only able to read even one poem with the true sentiments and feelings of the poet, and putting yourself in the shoes of the poet in those political and social circumstances, your understanding of the poem would be far more better. And the way you people rely on keys and you rely on other aids, that shall not be required. So those keys are only required when you're not able to put your own true self into the work. When you can do that, and when you are able to do that, then there is no need for those external aids. Then you do not need to memorize. You don't need to rote memorize. So you will not become handicapped. You will be on your own. Your own understanding of the poem will lead you to and will help you, in fact, to connect ideas, to connect one poet or his understanding to other poets, and this connection will broaden your approach, and it will help you more than these keys or these aids do in the examination. So I know as students our first and foremost priority is to prepare for exams, but reading reading more about that particular work, or about that poet, or the chief characteristics of that piece of literature in those times, there is no substitute for that reading, and there is no substitute for an understanding that you build from that reading. So go for that rather than for these cheap methods of learning. Now let us just recap the whole course. Let us retrace our steps. Let us go back, start from the beginning, and see what we've done throughout this course, and what were those different stages through which poetry passed. So we started with the Romantic period. We started with this great period, this great movement in the early part of the in the latter half, which started in the latter half of the 18th century, and which was part of the most part of the 19th century. And in the Romantic period, we saw shifts in the view of nature and poetry, as well as the role of poet. We saw that these shiftings in view about nature, about poetry, and about the role of poet, they came about as a result of a reaction to the previous age, as a reaction to the Augustan age. So there were shifts in views, okay, and then from imitation of human nature, the major function becomes the expression of the poet's emotions. This is another shift now. In the 18th century, the purpose was imitation of human nature. In literature, in literary forms, and especially in poetry, human nature was imitated. But in the Romantic period, or with Romantics, the function of poetry becomes the expression of the poet's own emotions. The relation of the poem to the poet is more significant than its relation to its audience. And then we also saw how in the Romantic period the poem becomes part of the poet, and they are indivisible. The poet is part of the poem. They are both indivisible. You feel his presence in the poem also. So that relationship is more significant, the relationship between the poet and the poem, that is more significant than the relationship between the poem and the audience, which we find in the modern era. So Romantic period was different. The language also, you see, we saw how the Romantics reacted against the Augustan trends. The language of the ordinary is preferred over the artistic style of the previous century. We saw the extension of horizon was social as well as chronological, because the primitive and heroic societies become more and more objects of interest. So there was a social social influence, but there was also this chronological study, because we see that these Romantics, they look far back. They look at the primitive and the previous and the old heroic societies for inspiration. People living outside urban gentility are regarded as proper subject matter for poetry. The common and the ordinary people become the characters of poetry. And Wordsworth, in his own words, he says, humble and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. Because in that condition of life our elementary feelings coexist in state of greater simplicity and consequently can be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated. I have just put up this piece for you because in Wordsworth's own words, he's giving you us an explanation why he chose the rustic, the ordinary, the common people over the genteel, over these the elite class of the urban society. So he believed that since they are purer, since their language is closer to nature, and they are more simple, so they have a better understanding of life and of human nature and of all things, so they are offer a better study. And the Romantics, we saw, also move beyond the polished life of the men in cities and their sensibilities to explore ballads and folklores in literature. We saw a trend of writing ballads and folklores return to literature. The new political and social ideas also shaped new beliefs. The French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and notions in psychology all played their part. We saw that all of that being displayed in the works of the Romantic poets, especially the first generation, Wordsworth and Coleridge. They were greatly affected by the French Revolution. Even Shelley was, and Keats too. But Wordsworth and Coleridge show their sadness at the events by turning away from city, turning away from the worldly, materialistic life, and looking towards nature for sustenance, for comfort. And their reactions to turn towards nature was also sparked by the industrialization, by the industrialism which was taking place in the major cities of England. So Industrial Revolution also affected these Romantics. And then psychology, these new ideas that were developed, that we shall see will reach their peak in the Victorian era, but these new ideas were also playing their part. So we see that although the Romantics are exploring nature, but they're exploring nature in relation to their own inner feelings. So they are at the same time discovering their own psychology, and by focusing on their own mental processes. And with them, we see also that the poem becomes an organic whole. And Coleridge is the first Romantic poet to emphasize it, and discussions of propriety and rules become irrelevant. So for them, a poem is an organic whole. It has to give out one complete meaning. It has to have unity. It has to have harmony in it. All the paradoxes, all the contradictions, all the conflicts, all the ironies, they have to be resolved within the poem, so that the poem can offer itself as a harmonious piece. And but we see with them that with this harmony, the discussions on propriety and rules, this becomes irrelevant. Unlike the Augustan poets, who were obsessed with rules, who were obsessed with propriety, who were obsessed with the technical details, who were obsessed with the idea of how to write and what was right, what was the right way of writing, and discouraging experimentation in verse. The Romantics rebelled against those values, so traditions in art, and they like to experiment. They like to write by their own will, but keeping the work of art as a harmonious, unified whole. The poem refers back to the poet, out of whose experience it is generated, rather than forward to the audience. This also we can understand once, because now we have studied their poetry, how this is true. We know that all the poems of Romantics that you have studied, in all those poems, the poem is reflecting the poet's feelings, the experiences. So the poem refers back to the poet. So when we are discussing the poem, we are always referring to the poet again, rather than the poems referring to us, who are the audience. So the address of the poem is again, it appears that it takes us back to the poet. The Romantic poet is isolated from society and desires to escape from his loneliness not by human companionship, but by discovering man through external nature. They are isolated people, the Romantics. We saw Wordsworth was isolated, Coleridge was isolated, Shelley was isolated, Keats was isolated, Byron was isolated. This sense of isolation is strong with them. Each one of them did not feel belonged to the city. Each one of them did not feel belonged to the society. They were recluse, they were rebels, they lived on the hinges of society. So, but they did not escape, they did not seek human companionship, but they sought external nature. But this, and when they sought external nature, through nature, they were able to rediscover man. So their approach was indirect, but there lies the romantic sensibility, the depth of feeling, and the love for all mankind, because through nature they learned to love all mankind. The romantic poets that we studied during this the course included William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, and Percy Bysshe Shelley. And we discussed different works of these poets also. Let us briefly look at Wordsworth's nature of poetry again. Now, we saw that for Wordsworth, poetry was a record of a state of mind, which the poet records. So, because in his own words, it is poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. So, it is a poetry, for him a poem is a record of a state of mind. It is composed in a tranquil mood. And a poet for him was a man of unusual emotional sensibility, whose emotions were later recollected and produced an awareness of human and universal significance. So a poet was a sensitive and emotional creature. He was able to feel sensitively about things. His emotions were aroused due to those feelings, and the result of those emotions was kept in his mind, stored away in his mind. And when he was tranquil, he was able to retrieve those moments from his mind, and he was able to compose a poem. So, but he was a sensitive, emotional individual. The poem Tintern Abbey, we saw, revealed the development of his attitude to nature. We saw how he talks about his relationship with nature, and how that relationship with nature passed through different stages, and how he was able to view nature completely differently, as completely different to as he used to view it as a child. So Tintern Abbey, we saw how it was a comment on poets' increasing relationship and dependence on nature. The other poem that we did by Wordsworth was The Solitary Reaper. And The Solitary Reaper was also a comment and his appreciation of the rustic and the ordinary life. And we saw him praising the ordinary individuals, because the central character of the poem is the ordinary girl. And the next poet that we did was Coleridge, and you saw that Coleridge was unique. Coleridge was unique in the sense that while Wordsworth showed and spoke and wrote about the external nature, and he showed how much he was affected by the beauty of the external nature, and he spoke about how he felt a spiritual presence in the external nature, and he felt that for him nature was everything. For him nature was the prime mover. For him nature was the bestower of all things to him. For him nature was like a compassionate mother and a trustworthy friend. With Coleridge we see that the supernatural aspect of nature becomes the central focus in his works. It was initially a plan of the two when they were working together on the lyrical ballads which they jointly produced in 1798. It was a plan of the two that one would work on the natural scenes, write poems on the natural scenes talking about nature, and the other would take up the supernatural themes. So this original plan, maybe it was due to the sensibilities of different sensibilities of the two poets, but Coleridge seemed to continue with the tradition that he had set in the Lyrical Ballads, first edition of the Lyrical Ballads. So he brings out the supernatural aspect. He talks about the exotic places, he talks about demons, he talks about ghosts, he talks about ghost ships, he talks about supernatural phenomena of all kind. But the remarkable quality of Coleridge is to imagine. It is his imagination, it is the beauty of his imagination, it is the depth of his imagination with which he is able to bring the reader to an understanding of his works. He is able to reduce that gap between the reader and the supernatural world that he creates. We can enter that world and we can understand that world, because that supernatural world that Coleridge creates, it is not completely and wholly, a world which we cannot relate to, because his supernaturalism combines naturalism. It combines the aspects of nature. It is not alien to our sensibilities. It is not something that is unimaginable for us as human beings. So his supernatural world is unique in that sense. And he displays a romanticism which is quite different from Wordsworth. He combines the meditative and the magical. We see that he's brooding and he's meditating all along in his works, and he's introducing that magical world also. We studied two poems, Ancient Mariner and the Kubla Khan. And you saw that in Ancient Mariner he presented a symbolic adventure in which the handling of the visual detail, the selection and ordering of the incidents, the manipulation of the meter, the control and the deliberate varying of the mood and tone, and the combination of the familiar and the exotic combined to produce a powerful poem. So Ancient Mariner, the most popular poem of Coleridge, it has a more powerful effect on the readers, because Coleridge is exploring so many things in that poem, and it is also because of his ability to bring together the two different worlds, the supernatural and the natural, and he shows them as one. When the natural world is affected, the supernatural natural world also gets affected and takes its revenge from the mariner and the sailors. And in the same way, when the natural world is made happy, the supernatural world is also, forgives. It also, the supernatural world also forgives the mariner and the sailors. So they are shown as one. It was a very powerful poem that you studied, and there were lots of significant other themes, sub-themes related to that poem. But I will not go into those details here, but because I just want to remind you of those things in today's lecture. The other poem, Kubla Khan, we saw it was the most perfect example of what might be called the purely magical strain in Coleridge's poetry. Written under the effect of opium, if you remember, he was it was a dream he had seen, and later he composed it into a poem, but a completely magical poem, where a magical world is introduced to us, where that where a demon-like figure in the shape of Kubla Khan is brought to our minds, and a strange magical land with a strange dome which is sunny and which is frosty at the same kind, and which has light and which has darkness at the same time, and which has got a fountain which erupts with a powerful force from between rocks, and the description even of the falling of those fountain water is strange and magical. So a picture of the magical, of magic, of a magical world is created before us. But yet again, a beautiful and a poetically whole poem. Then we studied Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Shelley we saw was a political and a social reformer, and we saw in how in both poems he also shows his dependence on nature. And the first point here says that Shelley's political and social hopes were increasingly associated with his transcendental views of the universe. So he believed that the political and the social world needed change, and it needed reforms. It was corrupt. It needed to be completely destroyed, so that a new one can be made in its place. And there is a visionary integrity and a rhetorical force in his poetry. Because he's a reformer, he has this. He comes out as a visionary because we see him looking optimistically towards future. And there is a rhetorical force. The language that he employs is rhetorical, and it has a force in his poetry. It is sometimes he's sometimes repetitive also. Sometimes he's commanding people to do something, to have hope. So he has that rhetorical force of of a politician's speech sometimes in his poems, especially in Ode to the West Wind. And the two poems that we studied included Ode to the West Wind and Ode to a Skylark. Ode to the West Wind, we saw how he talks about the force of nature, and he wants to be one with that. But that force in nature, that west wind, is a source of inspiration for him, because as that force in nature is able to bring about change in nature, so too Shelley wants to bring about change in the society, in his world. And Ode to the Skylark was also inspired by that bird, by that object of nature, and how he describes the bird as the inspiration for poets. Then we studied John Keats, and we saw that he was the most, the cherished one, the different poet in his own ways. He's a romantic in his relish of sensation, his feeling for the Middle Ages, his Hellenism, his conception of the role of poet, but made his own synthesis. And the most pessimistic of the romantic poets, we see him most of the time talking about the temporariness of life, talking about the shortness of life, and contrasting it with the eternity that he finds in nature or in art. And the poems that we studied were Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale, and Ode to Melancholy. All of these poems did bring out these themes that I mentioned here. His Hellenism we see is strong in all the poems. His constant reference to the Greek literature is to be found there. His feeling for the Middle Ages, we can also feel it there. And his the theme of shortness, the temporariness of life, that is also found there. So a melancholic, sad, and a pessimistic poet was John Keats. And then we have Victorian period. I told you sometime, somewhere when we were talking about these periods, that they are not clearly, there is no clear-cut boundary that this is where one period ends and this is where the other starts. These boundaries are fluid, they're flexible, but we have kept these because we just want to categorize these poets according to the sameness that they exhibit in their works, or the difference from a certain other group that they may have. So with this new century, which begins with the Queen Victoria coming to the throne, we see, and with the other multiple changes taking place in the society, because one form of way of living in the society gives way eventually to another form of living in the society. So when those manners of behaving, manners of living, manners of ideals, manners of faith, or manners of culture, when all of them, those change, then a new society emerges. So with that new society, a new form of literature with its new concerns emerges. So in the same way, we see new concerns being added to poetry. So the Victorian poetry echoes the romantic sense of isolation. The poet is cut off from the private grief. So in one way it is romantic in tradition. It still follows the same traditions that were brought in by the Romantic period. The sense of isolation we shall find in the Victorian poets also, because of industrialization that still continued, because of the changes in the world of science, the new discoveries, the new inventions, and the new psychological ideas, concepts, and because of the new ideas in economy, the birth of capitalism in the 19th century. All of these had also affected the sensitive writers of the age, and they also felt isolated from their society. So the sense of isolation we also find amongst the Victorian poets. The poet is cut off because of his own private grief from the world. And in that regard we saw that Tennyson worried about God and nature and man, about modern science and its effect on belief, and about the meaning of life. So with Tennyson we saw how he's, these themes of God, nature and man, he's absorbed with these themes because he's isolated. He turns away, turns his back to his society. He turns to God, he turns to nature, and he's contemplating about the state of man. And we also find in his works themes about modern science and its effects on the beliefs. We see him brooding over, meditating over these ideas and searching for a meaning to life. In some of his poems, the theme is an abiding sense of personal loss and overwhelming grief. The two poems, if you recall, we studied, Tears, Idle Tears and Break, 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 they were all based on his personal grief. So there was a strong sense of personal loss, and they are both filled with overwhelming grief. So this is another one main characteristic of Tennyson's poetry. Tennyson's poetry renders a mood rather than to explore it. So he does not explore the mood, he just expresses it to us. He just renders it. The images move outward to create a generalized mood rather than inward to build up a more complex meaning within the poem. So unlike the Romantics, unlike Yeats, who too is rendering a mood, who too is talking about his personal loss or personal mood, but he is able to go beyond that. He is able to build up to that feeling, he's able to build up to that mood, and he generates more complex meanings within the poem. As we see when he starts with his ode to a Grecian urn, and he's in a certain kind of mood where he's contemplating, meditating, and contrasting the temporariness of his own world with the world of the urn, with the eternity of the world of the urn. At the end we see he gives a more complex meaning to the poem when he comes to those last two lines, and he makes the utterance that beauty is truth and truth is beauty. That is all ye knew on earth, and that is all ye need to know. So unlike them, Tennyson, we see his images just move outward. They are only able to create a generalized mood. They give the feeling of loss instead of creating more meaning within the poem. That is why his poems, the two poems, Tears, Idle Tears, and the other one, Break, 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 they have singular themes, because he's talking only about, he does not talk about the complex feelings, other feelings that he may be having. The poems that were studied were included Break, 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 Tears, Idle Tears, and St. Agnes Eve. The next poet was Robert Browning, and we saw how he broke away from the handling of sensory images and brings back a colloquial vigor. Tennyson was sensuous poet. We saw him employing senses of sight, sometimes hearing, and sometimes of touch also. So we see him using those senses like the Romantics did, but Browning doesn't. He moves away from this. He brings back the colloquial vigor. His poetry is more colloquial. He's known for his dramatic monologues, and that was his chief characteristic, the ability to explore characters argumentatively. So through the dramatic monologues, his main function was to explore characters, to describe characters, to explore the mental anguish of personality of his characters. So the two poems that we studied in the course included A Grammarian's Funeral and My Last Duchess. And we saw how in both those poems Robert Browning used this technique of dramatic monologue, and how he used it successfully in both the poems, and how through this technique the characters in the poem and their personalities were revealed to the readers. The next poet was Matthew Arnold, and we saw that Matthew Arnold is a true voice of the sensitive Victorian intellectual, brooding over inevitable loss of faith and the meaning of life. We come across Arnold as a melancholic and a pessimistic individual. We see him brooding even more than either Tennyson or Browning did over the losses of the loss of moral values and the loss of religious faith from the society. So he displays the true sentiments of the sensitive Victorian intellectual, because we see him lamenting over the loss of faith and the loss of true meaning of life, which he felt was connected to the religious faith. Some elements of his poetry are the 19th century Hellenism, romantic interest in folktale and legend, the preference for solitary meditation in evocative surroundings. The Hellenism, we see like Yeats, he looks back, he looks towards the Greek culture for inspiration. In Dover Beach we did find instances of that, and he also exhibit those that romantic interest in folktale and legend. And although there was no such poem that we had in the course, but there are some poems written by him in which he's bringing out the medieval folk tales. So he turns towards past, but he turns towards the Greek glorious past. The preference for solitary meditation is also found, and most of the time we find him at some place of beauty and brooding over the meaning of life and the relationship of man with nature and the relationship of man with society. The poems that we studied included Dover Beach, Last Word, and Growing Old. The first two, Dover Beach and Last Word, if you remember, dealt with his with the emergent and with the dominant struggle in the Victorian era between the scientific values and the religious trends and the religious beliefs. So we see him talking about the contemporary issues, social, political and religious issues. And the third one, Growing Old, was slightly different, because we see him over there talking about how it feels like to grow old. But again, the pessimism we see is stronger there. Then after Matthew Arnold, we came to this other form of poetry, which belongs to another age, which is described as a modern age, which is described as in literature in terms of modernism. And modernism brings with it different tools, different techniques, different themes, because a lot was changing in the modern time. This was the 20th century that we're talking about, and in the 20th century we know the great changes were taking place socially and politically and economically, and even culturally and even religiously and even individually, in all the affairs of life, in domestic, in official, and in all the other domains. The relationships were being affected. So modernism is an important phenomena. It was a time when death and destruction was also witnessed by people, and with this witnessing of death and destruction, a lot of cynicism and skepticism had stepped in. The poets and the writers of the period, we shall see all of them employing and making use of the knowledge that was available to them in the period, the knowledge in the field of time, the knowledge from the domain of psychology, the knowledge from the other disciplines like philosophy, from narration. And so we shall see these literary writers, we shall see these literary men or women experimenting a lot in the modern period. So that is why modern period is an important and highly significant period, because yet again it is marked as a significantly different period with significantly different strains in themes, and with significantly different techniques and styles that are adopted by the literary men and women. So in all of these sense, this modern period is a complete break from all that had been written before it. So before we look, the poets that we studied should yet be fresh in your mind, because it was not so far back that you studied them. So a little bit about the modern movement. If you recall, it was the movement of the 20th century. The symbolists had a more revolutionary effect, and their influence was absorbed in a more radical manner. We saw the effect of symbolists on all of the modern poets, on all of the three poets that we studied, how their poetry was full of symbols. The French symbolist movement shared the interest of the Imagist movement in emphasizing clear and precise images, elimination of word that did not contribute, and a rhythm freed from the artificial demands of metrical regularity. So we saw how the poetry of the period, it showed influence of the symbolist movement, which took features of the Imagist movement as it became popular. And both the movements emphasized upon clear and precise images, upon the elimination of word which did not contribute, which was not important, and on a rhythm which was freed from the artificial demands of metrical regularity. So the poets like to experiment and invent their own poetic forms, invent their own metrical form. Modernism actually is defined in literature in a certain way. So you have that definition here. Now, modernism in literature reveals a breaking away from established rules, traditions and conventions, fresh ways of looking at man's position and function in the universe, and many experiments in form and style. So these are the three key features of this, of what we call modernist tradition in literature, or modernism. Modernism is a break from the established rules, traditions and conventions. It was a complete break from established rules. We shall see individual poets experimenting in their own ways with the technique, with the form of poetry, and bringing in their own individual self to the poem. And secondly, we see it offers a fresh way of looking at man's position and function in the universe. So in that sense also it cuts away from the traditional modes. Man's relationship with society, or man's relationship with universe, is viewed in a totally different manner, as you know by now, because you have studied the three modern poets, and you saw how when they're discussing human relations, or human in terms of the universe, how vague they are, how implicitly those relationships are discussed. When in the Whitsun weddings, for example, the poet is describing to you what he's witnessing. He's talking about human relationships. He is also hinting at the man's position in this vast universe, but nowhere does it come across to us explicitly. So they have their own unique way of looking at things. And the third thing is that we see also many experiments in form and style, and we saw a lot of experiments being done. We saw how enjambment was used as a technique in the 20th century poetry. We saw also how unique symbols were employed, and we saw also how a stanza sometimes can act as a mini sonnet. So a variety of forms and styles were employed by the modern poets. It is particularly concerned with language and how to use it. And this concern with language is a hallmark of modernism and modern writers, especially modern poets. This emphasis on language and this experimentation with language is a key feature of the modern poets. We saw how, each one of them is different in that regard. Auden likes to use, he likes to use his own kinds of words or diction, and that's special, and he avoids unnecessary words, and his special usage has even coined a label for him, the Audenesque, if I remember well it was called. And then we saw how Dylan Thomas, how what strange kind of syntax he uses. So this experimentation with language, this obsession with language, is a key feature of the modern poets. Then modernism cannot be separated from T.S. Eliot. In fact, it was a work of T.S. Eliot which had initiated what today we know as modernism. Like the lyrical ballads in 1798, jointly published by Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, brought about this revolution in thinking and style and content, in the same way T.S. Eliot's Wasteland brought about a change, fundamental change in the thinking patterns in the 20th century. So it is important that you are aware of it. That is why I am going to include it in today's lecture. Briefly and quickly we shall see what it entails. Now, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is a foundational text in modernism. Broken and fragmented and seemingly unrelated slices of imagery come together to form a disjunctive anti-narrative. In the poem, The Wasteland, there are images are broken, fragmented, and apparently they are unrelated. They seem to have no connection. So this unrelated imagery comes together, broken imagery and fragmented imagery is there, and they all come to form a disjunctive anti-narrative. It is called an anti-narrative because it is a narrative which challenges a traditional or conventional narrative style, and it calls attention to itself rather than to the poet or to the reader or to the society. The language attracts us, or this technique attracts us to itself. So the reader is forced to pay attention to the technique, is forced to pay attention to the language, is forced to pay attention to the images or the symbols that the poet has used. The reader is thrown into confusion, is unable to see anything but a heap of broken images. This is the result of the modern or the effect of the modern poetry upon the reader, as I'm sure you felt with the three poets that we discussed. But that's also their beauty. The reader has to make meaning from dislocation and fragmentation. This construction of elusive meaning is essential to modernism, and this is important. So from this fragmentation, the reader has to draw his meaning, has to draw and make an interpretation. And this construction of elusive meaning, this feeling that we can never be sure that we have arrived at the true meaning, this is essential to modernism. Never being able to grasp at the true reality, never being able to hit at something concrete, that is what is described as modernism. Always elusive, always out of bounds, not in grasp. These are the hallmarks of modernism. And we started with William Butler Yeats, and you saw how his symbols and images play an important role in his poetry. The imagery in Yeats's poetry is arranged in pairs of contrasts. He uses lots of oxymorons, paradoxes, conflicts. Man and nature, the human world and fairy world, the transient and the eternal are paired against each other. All these words are paired. We saw it in numerous poems that we studied. We saw it in The Second Coming. We saw it in Growing Old, and we saw it in also his other poem, The Rose Tree. So he's pairing these contrasts together. He was fascinated by both Irish legend and the occult. The occult tradition is a significant part of his poetry, and an understanding to his occultism is important for your understanding of his poetry. His poems included the Easter Rising 1916, The Rose Tree, The Second Coming, Sailing to Byzantium, and Wild, Soon and Cool. Then the next poet was W.H. Auden, and we saw how Auden is inventive and explorative. His ability to make arresting verse out of informal observation or a confession combined to make him one of the most continuously interesting of modern poets. So his verse becomes arresting because of his own casual way, the casual manner he composes it, because of the simple, ordinary manner in which he writes. His poetry is arresting, it is interesting, it is captivating, and it makes the reader, makes him in fact one of the most continuously interesting. He's still famous, and he's becoming more famous because of his simplicity, because of the ordinary touch that is part of his poetry. And his poems that we studied included The More Loving One and As I Walked Out One Evening. The next was Dylan Thomas, and with Dylan Thomas we saw how breathless and daring images he was used. His compound adjectives, he suggested a liberating verbal energy, and with him we saw also how his syntax, he experiments with syntax, how his syntax is apparently ungrammatical, but how he uses that as a technique to make meaning more elusive, to confuse the readers further, to juxtapose, to bring about or highlight the conflicts more. So this daring, the use of this, this daring quality of him is something that makes him remarkable amongst the modern poets. He's daring because he uses strange adjectives, he uses a strange syntax, he uses daring, bold imagery. So he is a daring poet. And the poems that we studied included Death Shall Have No Dominion and Clown in the Moon, the two, in fact, really beautiful poems, having a real lyrical quality about them. The last poet that we did was Philip Larkin, and his poetry is seen as typically ambivalent, with their prolonged debate with despair and energy. And we see that he also achieves transcendent beauty through his poetry. The poems that we studied included The Whitsun Weddings and An Arundel Tomb. So these were the poems, these were the poets and their works that we studied throughout the course. The course now comes to an end, and with this conclusion, I think I'd just like to suggest to you that as you go over the contents of the course, you need to improve your reading further. You need to explore the poets more, you need to explore their works more, so that you have a better understanding of their poems, and you have a better understanding of the author or the poet itself. So you, as students of literature, you do not only limit yourself to what you have before you or to your course contents, but you have to go beyond that. You have to study some other works by these poets so that you can get an understanding of their styles and of their themes, and you can evaluate and you can form your own judgment on the basis of your understanding. So I hope that you have acquired something and you have learned something from the course, and today was our last lecture. So the course concludes today. So I hope that you're going to keep my advices and my suggestions in your mind when you study for your final exams or when you do your assignments, and you bring your own personal touch and your personal interpretations and your understanding to your works. So with these words, I take leave from you, and I wish you best of luck for your future, and especially for this course. Thank you very much.